So we're about to start the Q&A.
We've got all of our presenters. There's Yoni, hello. Hello, Vivian. Hello, Nithya. Hello, Rebecca. Hello, David. Hello, Greg. Charmaine, Loriana, Nick Thomas, and Lucy in the corner there. Has everybody got their audio on? We're ready to jump in and all talk at exactly the same time. Time starts now. So there's a bunch of questions that have come from the agitators and some informed by what the advocates have been putting forward. The way we're going to operate this is that we're just going to select some of these questions and get the agitators to ask them directly to their favourite panellist at this stage. Not favourite, but you know what I mean. So we're going to start with Nithya. Nithya has a question for Greg Marston.
Certainly. Let me just jump back through this beautiful list. Greg, I think what I was interested in your talk was that discussion you had around the cultural insult, and also the discussion around this idea that UBI is going to decrease employment and how those two things speak to each other. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about what you think a policy framework that actually starts to counteract that cultural insult of the poor or the unemployed as somehow subordinate or lesser in our society, and where you've seen policies, whether in Australia or globally, that frame that a little bit more equitably. And also, I'm curious about how you think we would articulate some sort of an evidence that a UBI doesn't in fact decrease employment, and these alternate ways of value making, and how we can present that as an equivalent measure, an equivalent asset to employment. So, over to you.
Thank you. Lots of good questions there. The last question is probably the easiest to some extent, which is about the evidence base. So there is lots of good overseas studies that have looked at where basic income pilots or basic income schemes are still in place, and show that what they did do was improve people's health, that people kept involved in paid work, that they enrolled in education. So the evidence base is large and growing, and I think that comparative case studies really do provide some solid foundation for, I guess, going forward with this without the fear that introduced a basic income people, wouldn't engage in paid employment. Having said that, I think that at the same time you want to, as we're talking about in terms of the cultural politics, open up all the ways in which people make a contribution, but recognising that it's a really difficult task because these myths run very deep in our society, particularly around deserving and undeserving, as Loriana was talking about. They go back to the Elizabethan poor laws, the principle of lesser eligibility, which said that basically you've always got to make the worst paid job look better than state support, and we've also always had a very strong surveillance approach and control approach to people in poverty. We used to have the workhouses in the 1800s, and now we've got the equivalent of what Virginia Eubanks calls the digital poorhouse, the way in which we track people in terms of, what they're doing and declaring income. And of course, in this country, we had the infamous robo-debt scandal that kind of, painted all of the ways in which we spend a lot of time, a lot of money surveilling people when we'd be much better putting that money into people's pockets. Because the problem is not, as Charmaine was talking about, that we need to condition how people spend the money. We just need to give people enough money to meet all of their essential services, and people will spend that money wisely. So there has to be more trust built into the system. And certainly, the cultural challenge, I think, is as important as the economic distribution, because in this country, you have to look at the policies that we've just announced in response to the pandemic. Job appears in all of them. Job seeker, job keeper, job maker. I'm waiting for job baker next week. We'll throw in some flour, some yeast, knead a little bit, and hopefully it'll rise, right? But, basically, as people have said, what they've done is provide people with an economic insecurity. We pause some of the conditionality. That we are providing a form of economic security, and we should be proud of that and stand up for it rather than, put it all through the prism of job and work. And I think that's a tragedy, and it's also a very one-dimensional view of what constitutes, humanity and a good society. So it's care work that's made us get through this pandemic. It's solidarity. We need to reward those workers at the front line and pay them more, certainly not detracting from labour market inequalities. But, we also just need to recognise that if you give people a basic economic security, then lots of the other problems we worry about will go away, at least in my view, when I'm optimistic.
Thanks, Greg. That leads into the next question actually really perfectly.
So the next question, I think that Vivian, you wanted to ask a question to Loriana.
Your first question, the big one.
The big one.
Just looking for what I wrote earlier.
Next time we'll have another cryptpad.
Yeah, sorry.
No, you're good. You go. You ready?
Yes. Basic income may enable us to shift from an exploitative, extractivist capitalism to an ethics of care that respects the dignity of all life forms. And Pope Francis recently advocated for the need for a universal basic income and said that now is the time for people to be put at the centre, united to heal, to care and to share. But care work, as we know, is often performed behind the scenes and taken for granted. It tends to be poorly paid, if at all. Yet without such work, human beings wouldn't survive. In what ways do you think, Loriana, that basic income can grant visibility and privilege economies of care, bringing them back to the centre of how we operate as a society?
Thank you very much, Vivian. That's an amazing question, and I think it touches at the core of my previous argument, in the sense that, so universal basic income is just simply a policy instrument. The way and the effects that it will have on society, it really depends on how we frame it. So on the values, this is why I was talking about the vision. So what kind of society are we aiming for? And obviously, so the presentation I gave before and the way I see universal basic income is of a system embedded in a discourse where care is the fundamental value, because it recognizes our species primarily as a caretaking species, because that's what we are social beings. And so I think universal basic income per se, so if you were to introduce universal basic income within this system, within the dominant hegemonic discourses, no, this will not automatically lead to an increased visibility of care work. I don't think we can assume any direct link. So it has to do with the discourses, with the stories that we tell about each other. So we are implementing a universal income because we do value a set of contribution, and we think that care is a solid, fundamental way in which we as humans contribute to the well-being of the collective, I think. So it's not just paid work, it's a very narrow limitation imposed on what we as humans can do. Yes, it's a tricky question because, again, per se, it will not cause this shift. It's how do we frame it, within what, broader discourse for social change do we frame it? I think that's, one based, again, on intrinsic value of care. Yeah. Hope it answers it.
Thank you.
Thank you. We've got a question for Charmaine here from Nithya.
Charmaine, I think a lot of people would agree with the idea that probably our current government is not going to bring in a UBI tomorrow. But like we've seen with the doubling of job keepers, I'm wondering if, job seekers, I'm wondering if you think that there might be some other elements of a UBI that we can implement temporarily or that we can implement in this environment. I thought what you said about the income floor was really interesting. So I guess the two-part question first is the elements that you think we can fight for temporarily that are possible under this government. And the second part is where you've seen something like an income floor work, maybe in a micro set of economies, whether it's a set of organizations, a local or a state-based scheme, and if that's something that we should be opting for to try and bring in a localized UBI or an LBI, a localized basic income, instead of opting for the grand scheme in the first run.
Yeah, thanks so much. Really good questions. I'd argue that much of what the government has done in its response to COVID reflects much of what we would want or want to see in a UBI or even an income floor. So, as I mentioned, they've made quite a large number of changes to facilitate access to the social security system, which has had the effect of, while it's not totally universal system, it's taken us a long way there. So they've done things like remove the assets test for the unemployment payment. They've also expanded the income test for couples. So couples with an income of up to $80,000 now can access that payment. So that's had the effect of bringing a large number of, I guess, higher wealth or higher income households into the system, which I think is interesting in itself that they've done that, right? And as I mentioned earlier, they've removed a lot of the barriers to getting income support. And I'm really hopeful that many of those conditions that have been suspended temporarily can actually be abolished on the other side of this. So things like the liquid assets waiting period, which is this horrible thing where if you've got, more than $5,000 in the bank, you can't access an unemployment payment. Never mind that we all need some kind of, level of money in the bank in case the fridge goes bust, just as, the story I told earlier indicated. So I think there are actually many things in the government's response that it can continue relatively easily. And that puts us in good stead to have a more universal system in the future, if that's the way we're headed. To your point of where this has perhaps been done at a smaller level, look, I think Greg touched on it earlier, but the Finnish UBI experiment was really interesting, and they've done some decent evaluation of it. The latest evaluation report found that whilst it did not increase levels of employment among participants, it also didn't lead to a decrease, and it actually gave people more confidence. They had improved well-being. So for the cohort who was unemployed who participated in that, there were actually some really great outcomes, which I think provides a really great lesson for the rest of us. There has been some suggestion that perhaps we do a localised model here in Australia. Eva Cox has suggested that the cashless debit card trial sites be transferred to a UBI or a LBI trial to see how that would go in action here. I don't think the government is taking that proposal too enthusiastically, but I think it is an interesting thing to look at, especially in some of those areas where the prospect of getting sustainable and secure paid work over the long term is next to none. In some of these remote communities, they just aren't the jobs for people to access. So what is the solution there? Should we subject and, penalise these people with this completely evidence-free card, or, should we look at other models that, help people to, go down their own path? And I think that's an interesting idea for Australia. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Charmaine. So we've got a question now. Rebecca Conroy, you wrote a question, and it's about Loriana's ideas about storytelling and the power of discourse. And I thought that this could be a really interesting question. Maybe Loriana could speak to it as well as David. Did you want to ask that question?
Sure, but before I ask the question, I just want to comment on the amazing community television set that you've got going. I'm just like, just gagging to say something about that. I'm just loving it all. And hi, everyone.
Just comment that this is an amazing sculpture that has been donated to this community television set by an amazing artist called Andrew Hustwaite. At the last minute, we're like, what the fuck can we hang in the background? We called him up and he's like, yeah, I've got this thing.
It's 100% authentic community television. It's like, it's really nailed it. So well done. Yeah, and hi everyone, and thanks to the hosts and producing this very important topic to talk about. I'm zooming in from Gadigal Bidjigal country from east in Sydney, near the ocean. So my questions, I mean, I just had a comment, just a lot of the contribution that Loriana was talking about just reminded me of the kind of the strength and the power of discourse. Just, you know, on one level, we've got this kind of, you know, debate about, you know, can we afford it? What would policy-wise, what would we need to change? But the most profoundly kind of, I guess, for my, as an artist as well, is thinking about how do we shift this narrative? There seems to be like so much work that needs to be done just to shift this narrative. And it got me thinking about the, you know, the William Golding Lord of the Flies, because it was recently in the spotlight that the original story, you know, the story that draws from is a true, you know, a real story about 6 Samoan boys who were shipwrecked for 16 months on an island. And it's just that story about Lord of the Flies that we've kind of had to accept, that it's the version of humanity that tells us that, oh, we're just going to destroy each other, we're all about competition. And that is not actually the story that represents most of the world. And it was just ironic that what it represented was William Golding's version of the world. And he was, by a lot of accounts, not a pretty terrible man. So it just made me think about that, you know, the strength of the discourse. The discourse is a really powerful, very material force. And I really liked that. And I also just, David, I just could not get that cooking show metaphor out of my head. You know, like the stats are so terrible. Like, I mean, I don't know if I needed to hear that, you know, 1/37th. But you know, it is really stark. And I just imagine that as a kind of, what metaphors are we most relating to? You know, like if we could visualize that as someone who was getting more of a share of the pie and literally stuffing themselves, you know, like it feels like there's this real, a scarcity that's happening on, like we're so malnourished on this side, and then there's this bloating on the other side. So just something to think about as a future cooking show.
I like that idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. Do a cooking. It's like Le Grand Bouffe.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, the artists will be the little mice picking up after the end of it.
That's right. The tragedy is on us.
Yeah.
The tragedy is definitely on us. But the little crumbs off the table, yes, it's pathetic. It is actually like that, though, that kind of thinking about how do we value ourselves, and what we go in for and what we ask the government for is, you know, we just have a little bit, just a little tiny little bit. Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. That's so great.
I think one of the rules of advocacy that we've really failed in terms of the arts is that never ask for what you think you can get, ask for what you need.
Yeah.
Because in this kind of environment, we've been operating in, that has never worked in any space, but particularly for the arts, which I know well. I think there's a really interesting connection between your 2 points, really, because I mean you're sort of invoking Mr. Rutger Bregman and his, you know, a hopeful history. And
yes, he's an optimist.
What I like about what he's doing and what a number of people are trying to do And what you wrote down in that, in the chat, is that actually if we change our default setting to humans are basically good rather than humans are basically bad, we recalibrate pretty much all the values that generate our social policy.
Yeah.
That includes the arts. And so instead of a dystopian default setting, and certainly not a utopian default setting, there may be a third kind of default setting that's really comes from, looking at ourselves in the mirror and saying, I am many kinds of persons, but what I'm not predominantly is a bad person. I am not William Golding. I am actually, I would like to think that I could be in that group of boys on the island who took care of each other and agreed that they wouldn't fight. Mm. That's a great place for us to start thinking about what we can do. It doesn't mean that there's no contest. It actually means that the rules of the contest are defined by a sense of humanity rather than deprivation.
Yeah, and I think there were some other speakers that were drawing on the idea of this, demonizing of the poor, that poverty is seen as a moral failing, and even on the left as well, it's seen as kind of still quite a paternal attitude that the left have. Oh, we've got to help the poor get out of their problems, instead of asking why are they poor in the first place, so addressing that idea of there's so much emotion and judgment that's wrapped up in these positions. Yeah.
Thank you. Actually, before we go to the next question, Loriana, did you make any comment on that? Because it kind of stemmed from, stuff you were saying. You don't have to, of course, but
yeah. I would just like to comment on this whole discourse and this construction of the human being as competitive rather than cooperative. And again, it comes from a view of history that's been very selective, and we tend to forget that as a species, we lived pretty much 90% of our time in very cooperative, more tribal, collectivist settings. So there must be a reason, if we evolve or we got to where we are, which must be related to cooperation rather than competition, which, as we're witnessing, is not taking us very far, I guess.
Yes, Charmaine.
Just adding to your point, Rebecca, having a low income then also leads to organisations, I agree with you, including from the left, going, oh, well, we have to fix them somehow, and that's where we have these policies like the drug testing proposal, right? The idea is, oh, well, you're poor because you're a drug addict, and so we need to fix the drug addiction, right? Rather than go, actually, you're poor because your income is too low, and that's what we need to do. So, yeah, just want to put that in there.
Great. Thank you.
Thomas
Yes,
wants to speak.
Thomas wants to speak.
Release Thomas from the mute. Perhaps unmute yourself. Yeah, good.
Or can we do it ourselves? Thanks so much. So that reminded me of, so we all agree here, obviously. And I was just thinking, are we all in a bubble? And how can we reach the quiet Australians, which we know there are, and how, because we need them to build up the social pressure to get this things that it doesn't have to be UBI, of course, but we all know we need to fix the welfare system in some way. Together to achieve something like marriage equality, which was unavoidable because there was so much social pressure, and we had fighters on the left and in the churches who put so much resources into a fight against marriage equality. They couldn't withstand, they couldn't defend their position, because that was such social pressure that it needed to happen. And I believe we need something similar to fix this?
So I think that speaking of the church,
Yeah.
that leads really nicely onto a question that, Yoni, you had for everybody, but I wonder if maybe Nick and Thomas might want to speak to it first. It was the question about...
According to some scholars.
Yeah.
Oh, cool. Is it unmuted now? Hi, everyone. Yes, according to some scholars, well, several scholars really, this is a pretty general question, more philosophical question really, but it sort of occurred to me that some of our fundamental notions like creativity and freedom have been thrown out there without further elaboration. And as far as I understand, and according to many scholars, both freedom and creativity come from pretty theological Christian ideas that relate to, initially in medieval theology, the power of God, to whether God can control the world completely or whether God's freedom is restricted. And then, what we consider a notion of creativity develops from these ideas, because individuals start to think of themselves as being able to manifest the will of God by creating artworks through a power that they have. And so that's to simplify like 400 years of Christian philosophy. But anyway, and so it seems to me like we're borrowing ideas of creativity and art and freedom that are highly individualized, highly theological, that rest on notions of Christian and monotheistic ideas of creation of the world. So they're very, very different than indigenous or tribal notions that the world has always existed. And so the heavy Christian legacy of modern art and modern individualism might raise some issues that we want to discuss. Maybe it's too broad a question, but the debate, most of this debate seems to me to rest on very libertarian, individualistic principles. And so we're deeply embedded in the neoliberal discourse that we're trying to criticize. And I think it has to do with...
Something you can respond to in relation to that very heavy and heady bit of factoid in question?
Yeah.
Are they talking to us? Yes.
Sorry, Dario, who was that question for?
For Nick and Thomas. So I just took a general question, and I'm interested just because Thomas talked a little bit about, the kind of, the yes to same-sex marriage situation in Australia, and how, that really kind of pushed through a Christian narrative. And so, I think that maybe there's something that we could, maybe Thomas and Nick could talk a bit about what you've just kind of mentioned in relation to that legacy and what that really means, and how we can push through the neoliberal discourse. And beyond that, actually, the neoliberal actual ideologies that you're saying maybe are informing the idea around UBI?
Correct.
Okay, well, as an accountant, I'll try. I mean, I probably won't talk to the theology, maybe that kind of aspect as much, but I'll talk personally about maybe my experience a little bit. And I see art and creativity as connecting humans together, essentially. And that's how I kind of think about it in the practice in the business school. It's about how do we bring humanity back into a business school, essentially. Where often that human nature, that human connection, that idea of collaboration is actually kind of taken out. We kind of talk about our discipline a lot in a binary context. There's a right or a wrong. We teach it like a pure science. It's an objective way of doing something rather than a social construction. So when our students graduate and they leave and they go into those kind of professional environments and they practice their craft or their art, they see it in a very scientific way, that this is completely regimented. It's in place. It's immovable. And we just need to comply and do what we need to do to survive, or to obviously go up the chain and create that profit-driven notion. So where I think about accounting, I think art, and thinking about art and accounting together, is that art brings that human nature back into the accounting to turn it into some form of accountability. And so I know I haven't answered the question, but I'm not to me, art becomes, although it's something in the individual as a human connection, it's connecting us with each other and creates something in a collaborative form.
Go, Loriana. Release, Loriana.
Yes, I would like to address this question probably more on the freedom side rather than the creative side, even though the creative side certainly has a lot to be thought about in our theology, and Christianity in fact informs, it's part of our culture as well. So from the freedom side, I think we should not make the mistake of merging neoliberalism with libertarianism as a philosophy. They are not exactly the same thing. And the concept of freedom within libertarian thinking, which, again, it's part of our culture, because going back in time in our history and in the philosophy that has underpinned this history, we are daughters and sons of the Enlightenment. So there is this concept of freedom, yes, that it's individualized. So in the libertarian conception of freedom, the freedom to choose, to say no, of course it's an individual conception of freedom. But I also think that it would be even more utopic or dystopic to imagine to, completely get rid of this that is so embedded in us now. And so the libertarian conception of freedom does not deny the other version of freedom. We coexist also in our culture. So you can have both. You can think of yourself as an individual who can self-determine themselves, and also think of yourself as part of a system, and they exist together in our culture. And we have to acknowledge our culture, and that's the starting point to design, a culturally specific UBI, I think. Thanks.
Does anybody else want to add to that discuss there, or can we throw to another question before we open back out? And I think it might be nice. Nick and Thomas, are you staying with us, or do you have to head away? And awesome, great. And then maybe we can go back to what Thomas was talking about before and kind of evolve from there in regards to what might be possible. I just want to go back to something, Vivian, you pointed out a very specific question that I think would be good for our accountants in regards to the Australian context and the history in Australia in the labour context specifically.
Yeah, thanks, Dario. Yeah, we earlier were talking about the fact that in Australia, UBI is not a new idea, and in fact it was proposed in the 1970s as part of an inquiry into poverty that was commissioned by the then Whitlam government. And one of the key recommendations was guaranteed minimum income. In fact, my grandfather worked on one of the reports, which was called Poverty and Education in Australia. Unfortunately, as we know, those recommendations were shelved when Fraser came in, and the mentality of life isn't meant to be easy became the kind of motto of the day. And poverty, as we've discussed earlier, was seen as a moral failing. But my interest now is in this situation of the pandemic, where we're all vulnerable to a new kind of poverty. We're very much aware that poverty can happen to anyone. And I think, can we, if we can, how can we harness this collective new sensitivity to the realities of poverty? Is it possible to find a way of implementing UBI in Australia, taking a bit of a lead from what was produced in the 1970s, so reconnecting with something that's already been happening here?
Yeah, definitely.
General question.
We don't have to invent the wheel. The wheel is there already, and there's so many models which I gave a glimpse in our presentation of. But if you think about it, it all comes back to, does our current society, do they really want it? If they wanted it, we had it already. So I'm not sure, if we had that social pressure, we would find ways, we would have to I think that the greatest barrier is just the political will, and we as citizens have to convince our governments, our member of parliaments to work on this and to get it through. And again, I can only come up with something like marriage equality. We could come up with other social changes we had in the past, abolishment of slavery. All those things happened because there was enough social pressure to make them happen. And so I think maybe it was a good way now at this stage to use what you were referring to, the pandemic, to use that experience of many people who weren't in that situation before, in that situation of insecurity and uncertainty in an economic way. Maybe that's a good point, a good gateway to get into their thinking and educate them accordingly, and bring them near that there is actually other ways we can do things. We can organize our welfare system.
Did you want to add anything to that, Greg? I saw you raising your hand.
Just quickly, I know Charmaine wants to make a contribution too. I was just going to say that the other difference about the Ronald Henderson inquiry was that, Henderson and all the people that worked on that report and the multiple reports, they talked to people who are homeless, voices of people who were poor. And this was the first time really that had been the case. And when we look at welfare reform at the moment, the expertise of people who are in situation is not put front and centre in all the successive welfare reforms. So I think those voices are really important in challenging some of those stereotypes. The other thing I say about how we get social security systems, the big change is often those kinds of exogenous shocks, right? So it's kind of wars and depression, unfortunately, that turn private troubles into public problems. And that's when we got mass unemployment that we started to get the welfare state. But we also had a tax system that could pay for it because they had just funded the war effort. So social security became the kind of peacetime aim. So history, I think, is instructive in that sense, but there are lots of good ideas, but hopefully going forward, we don't need, another depression or another pandemic to point that way. But I think the other thing that I think is worth holding on to is that there might be some greater respect for all sorts of expertise out of this. If you look at how we've responded to the crisis, it's been the public health folks and the epidemiologists that, politicians where the countries have got it right have listened to them. And if we could see some of that retained when we look at problems like climate change or bushfires, which is linked to climate change, then I think we'd be in a much better place too. But that expertise needs to be, of people who are both in that experience, but also the people that, actually know something about the subject. I mean, otherwise we get a whole lot of populism and fear and all this ridiculous, assertions basically rather than arguments. And I think that's not good public policy.
Yeah, I just adding on to that and following on from Thomas's comment earlier about bringing the quiet Australians with us. We did some messaging work for the campaign we're running to increase unemployment payments, both before the last election, so early 2019, and we're just doing a new round now. And it's been fascinating seeing the difference. For somewhat moderate groups back in 2019, there was still a very clear thing that, unemployed people are bludgers and they shouldn't get any more money. And even among unemployed people themselves, they were saying, well, look, I should get an increase, but other unemployed people, it should be, restricted to the cashless debit card. Like there was that kind of mentality. But now, much more empathy. There is much greater understanding of what's going on for people. And we're really heartened by that. I mean, there's some other stuff that's kind of proving to be very sticky, but there's definitely been an increase in sympathy for people without a job and much more support for the government stepping in and providing that safety net. So there's a message of hope, I guess.
Rebecca, did you have something to say earlier? I saw you raising your hand.
Oh, yeah, it was in response to the kind of circuitous kind of conversation that was around Yoni's suggestion about the language we're using to dismantle, or the language that we is informed by these notions of the individual. And then, Loriana, I did want to kind of just respond to the assumption that, you know, that we're all children of the Enlightenment, as particularly on this land. European colonial thought is very foreign. Even as, you know, a colonial subject, not a dispossessed or a First Nations Indigenous. But it just made me think about the urgency around needing to shift from that, even if that there is a pre-existing and much more ancient and much, you know, more resilient definition or relationship to country and as humans that bring together a kind of more than human world. And it strikes me that, just in response to what Yoni was saying, that it's the kind of thinking we really need to shift if we're talking about a UBI. If that's the conversation, if that's where we want to be, then we really do need some radical redefinitions of the human. And so I guess just to, you know, remark that that's I want to have that debate, you know. I want to, you know, I don't care if we throw out the individual and the Enlightenment and the individual rights. I'm ready to throw those out, actually.
Yeah. Don't throw the water out with the baby, I think is what it's, isn't it?
No, there's a drought and you need that water.
But I think, you know, what you're talking about is so integral. I mean, it's critical thinking and maybe mixing in with, you know, Indigenous epistemologies, which we need to marry. And, you know, I've got this silly term I talk about at the moment, critical dreaming, which is where art comes into it too, because it's really about imagination, right? And it's about how you reimagine and understand your relationship through time with other beings that are around. And we know that we can listen to that here. That is something powerful that we have in this amazing land that we happen to be very lucky to be living on, as well as across the globe. You know, this is not something that we experience, but it's closer to us to hear it, because dispossession is much it was a few hundred years ago, as opposed to a few thousand years ago in, you know, the land of Europe and these other kind of places. But maybe it is about opening up to those epistemologies that are here, that are still practiced, and then using that as an opportunity to, you know, amplify and go, hey, how about these as options? You know, these are still very real and still very practiced. And I think that's the work we have to do, you know. Hopefully someone can pay for that at some stage, you know, with the UBI, but we have to do that work, and it's all interconnected. Sorry, I'm supposed to be hosting, not having any opinion.
But maybe we can, you know, think about, maybe we should rob some banks, you know, like in terms of strategies, just going back to what Nick and Thomas were, you know, like the very practical question that is posed, that Thomas was kind of agitating us to think about, you know, how do you reach the quiet Australians? How we, you know, we need some radical ideas to address that, I think.
Totally. And you also mentioned slavery and gay marriage, and what is it in the will of people that makes people want to go for these things? Is the will there at the moment? Of course it's not, because they don't know about it, but it is in them. Like, nobody actually truly intrinsically wants slavery, but they will go for it if it fulfills whatever system they're in. Like if it feeds them and they don't have to do anything about it. This kind of.
But that also kind of comes back to Loriana's point around discourse and around like the stories that we're told about ourselves and the stories that we're told about each other. And, you know, of course, people will go for slavery if they're told that that's over and over and over again, that's what's happening, I suppose.
Totally, the seriality, which is why there needs to be a cooking show by David as part of it too, because that's not part of that current seriality. Nithya wants to come in. Can we open all of them?
Yes, so just...
Sorry, Nithya, go.
That's okay. I just wanted to say something about that quiet Australians comment and this idea of bringing in a bipartisan support. I think earlier when Nick and Thomas, you were speaking about increasing tax and decreasing the welfare state, or the bureaucracy around the welfare state, which, you know, in a cold current government ways, oh, that's less public government jobs and that's more tax, and you know, it's a pretty hard sell. And so I guess I'm interested in what does it look like? What is the most bipartisan financing system that we can see here for a model like this? Obviously, things like subsidies to industries like fossil fuels that are becoming slowly redundant are one of the ways that we should be exploring. But what is a bipartisan way to push this that isn't just reliant on the values that everybody on this call basically shares, but also brings in people? And just as a side note to that, I want to note that in America, even lower middle income people are against universal public health care. And that just shows you how deeply the rhetoric can go in thinking that, if somebody else gets it, that means there's some sort of something I'm not getting, or something that's free that I'm, and I don't think that Australia is as far away from that type of mentality as it should be. So yes, just throwing that.
I'll leave that as a comment, Nithya, because we're actually totally running out of time, and this has been a fantastic conversation. I just wanted to ask, David, do you want to say anything else? Because we haven't heard from you for a little bit. Maybe as the final word, as the Minister for the Arts, what do we need to do?
Minister for Arts, actually. I think that
sorry.
Look, I was really, I've just been thinking so much about Yoni's question, and I found it really fascinating because I can't really answer that question.
Philosophers.
Sorry?
Philosophers will do that to you.
They do that to you. I can't answer that question, in any other ways as an artist. And so I just want to say, that the kind of the embedding of Christianity in the discourse is so profound, and it gets conflated with the overriding ideological discourse of neoliberalism. I'm really paraphrasing there, but it made me think of what have I drawn my practice from, and on my mum's side, she's Calabrian, and so I'm drawn to generations before her, just a couple of generations before her, where there was a really strong paganism in that kind of peasant culture that's really came with my grandparents when they came here. And then when I was in my late teens, I left Melbourne from regularly from the age of 15 until I was 21, and I travelled all around Australia. And one of the things that is completely inscribed in my practice as an artist is the experience of landscape. And through that, I basically, went and learned from, various First Nations people about what land meant to culture. And so I've got these conflations of, this sort of personal background, this place in, this place that I live in, but also I have always had an incredible attraction to Asia. So I've always studied, with Japanese and Korean artists and practitioners, and I'm just trying to find the line of, Christianity in there, and it just keeps bumping this way and that way and this way and that way. I haven't answered the question, but I'm grateful to have the opportunity to have allow me to kind of speak my thoughts out loud. So thank you.
That's fabulous. Thank you from the Minister for Artists about that very, an approach of multiplicity to an extraordinarily, complicated set of relationships that we have over time. And before we're going to go now, and we're going to hear from the future Minister for Artists, who I only met a couple of days ago, actually quite an amazing performance poet from Sydney called Mel Ree, and she's going to tell us the truth in a moment. And before we go there, we're going to go to another little sting, a little video that's been put together by the fabulous Sarah Jane Woolahan. Thank you for the conversation, everyone. It's been really good.
Thanks for bearing with us.